The women of France farmed the rich soil with the same love as their menfolk, but they could not supply the same strength and skill. French land produced less food and prices began to go up.
To the kill, but only the first are served. Fruit and vegetables are still in good supply, but dearer than last year.
The prices at the central markets are much higher than at the end of last year. Cabbages cost 60 or even 70 centimes each. Prices of groceries are also increasing by leaps and bounds. At Corbeil Market, the average increase is about 300%.
The burden of shortages and rising prices fell heavily on France's poor families, many of them trying to live on a soldier's pay and allowances, or even worse, on a widow's pension. But the nation was still welded together by the patriotic flame of the Union Sacrée. The French solved the problem of munitions with the same courage and resourcefulness that had turned defeat into victory on the Marne. This nation of individualists submitted to government control, and by the end of 1915, French industry was sending the army most of the munitions it needed. Women were the key to success in the factories.
They have quickly adapted themselves to this delicate work for which they seem to be specially suited. Many of them have accepted fairly dangerous jobs like the handling of fuse detonators or explosives. Today, shells are being almost entirely finished off by women. All are working very hard, many of them with serene looks on their faces. Some, on the other hand, look grim. They are probably thinking they are helping to avenge some dear victim of the war.
And a few hundred miles away, German women were working with equal devotion. The Germanic empires were now a beleaguered fortress, cut off by the British blockade from the wheat lands of America and the beef of the Argentine. Behind the victorious troops of the German and Austrian armies, who stood everywhere on enemy soil, life was becoming grayer and grimmer. Since January, bread had been rationed, and it now included potato flour.
One met people who had come from Berlin and who said that one could not see any signs of a war there. They must be blind. Bread cards are not the only outward and visible sign of the war. Did you ever see a private soldier, excepting a few orderlies, in Unter den Linden in peacetime? Which is full of them now. Not very warlike in their clothing, carriage and appearance, many of them wounded, all of them feeling and acting as the chief personage of the drama, as well they might.
Vienna remains a city of pleasure, but in its dark suburbs, misery is on the increase, and the mothers wring their hands beside the beds of their children, because their young lives are threatened by enteritis, caused by eating the horrible war bread.
The bread ticket did not favor fair shares. It was not meant to. I had no difficulty anywhere in getting all the wheat bread I wanted. It was taken for granted that I belonged to the class that did not have to eat war bread.
The British knew nothing of the horrors of retreat and occupation, of casualties counted in hundreds of thousands. But their cost of living was rising fast.
Bread last year was 2 3 farthings, and is now 4 halfpenny the £2 loaf. The price of meat for baking had doubled in price. That of the cheapest cuts for boiling had trebled. I hardly know how to make ends meet. I have 5 children, and am expecting another in June. We're eating less, and have pawned many things to make up the difference between prices before the war and now. But that can't go on.
In Britain, too, the burden of the war was falling most heavily on the poor, and the poor included the families of serving soldiers.
Times was very, very hard, and I only had 12 and 6 a week, and therefore I couldn't go out and spend like anyone else. And I used to sit at night and try to do a bit of reading or a bit of sewing with my hands to pass the time away like that. But it was very, very hard, and my times would wonder what he was doing or if he was thinking about me. and wondering how he was going on, when I should see him again, and all things like that.
A private's pay was small. So were the allowances for a wife and children. Any official delay in payment meant a trip to the pawn shop. Death or mutilation in the country's service could mean utter poverty for the hero's family. A royal warrant issued by Lord Kitchener said,
"A pension or gratuity for the dependents of a deceased soldier shall not be granted as a right. It shall not be granted or continued when the applicant is proved to be unworthy of the award in the opinion of our Army Council, or unless the soldier's services were in their judgment such as to justify the award."
To the middle and upper classes in Britain, the war was still something to read about in the newspapers or on a poster.
The town is vibrant with the call to arms. Posters appealing for recruits are to be seen on every hoarding, in most shop windows, on omnibuses, tramcars, and commercial vans. It was strange at first to see officers in uniform in the omnibuses and trams, but the novelty of it has long since worn off.
The cartoons of Bruce Bairnsfather, an officer serving in France, appeared regularly in the Bystander. They created a new national image, Old Bill, the long-suffering soldier whose sour humor rose above every danger and discomfort.
O star of eve, whose tender beam falls on my spirit's troubled dream.
Give it a good ardent bird. You can generally hear them fizzle a bit first if they're going to explode.
Well, if you know of a better hole, go to it.
Hey, what was that, Bill? Trench mortar. Ours or theirs? And to think that it's the same dear old moon that's looking down on him.
This stinking moon will be the death of us. Well, Alfred, how are the cakes?
As Old Bill bestowed his advice on young Bert, the newcomer, the more frightening the danger, the funnier the joke became. Even soldiers laughed at these cartoons. People at home found them very reassuring. The reality was a long way away.
They hadn't any conception of what it was like. And on occasions when I did talk about it, my father would argue points of fact that he couldn't possibly have known about because he wasn't there. And that, I think, was probably the general sort of approach and air of the public at large. They didn't know. They hadn't any conception, and how could they? They knew that people came back on leave covered with mud and lice, but that was as far. They had no idea of what kind of danger we were in. I think they felt that the war was one continual sort of cavalry charge, that one spent all day and all night chasing Germans, or they chasing us. And had they realized the strain of sitting in a trench and waiting for something to drop on one's head, I don't think they would have considered it war. Just play. And, of course, the general idea was that England couldn't possibly lose.
Officers on leave noted how little the middle classes had been touched by war.
In spite of the number of men in uniform in the streets, the general indifference to and ignorance about the war was remarkable. The universal catchphrase was, "Business as usual."
Against this background of business as usual, Lloyd George toured the country to see conditions for himself and to drive forward the industrial revolution which would give the troops the shells and guns they needed. He used all his personal magic, all his ruthlessness.
In 1915, I drove Mr. Lloyd George, when he was Minister of Munitions, on his munition tour of Wales, going from town to town. And when we arrived at Newport in Monmouthshire, just as he got out of the car, someone in the crowd shouted out, "Why don't you send out some guns?" Instantly he replied, "Why don't you come and help?"
While Lloyd George was touring the country, inspecting, persuading, energizing,